Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Previously, I stated that a statement is a sentence which can either be true or false, and we represent statements with lowercase letters such as P. So P would be a statement which has a truth value, means it's either true or it is false. The negation of P is written as like this. This is not P. So if the statement is the sky is blue, its negation would be the sky is not blue. And again, the truth value of a statement is simply whether it is true or it is false. Also, we suggested last time that statements can be combined, and these are called compound statements, like here. And you can combine statements either in the form of a conjunction using the word and you can combine statements using in the form of disjunction or using the word or. So compound statements can be synthesized or produced in conjunction using the word and symbolically we write this like this. And compound statements can also be made using the word or, and this is called a disjunction, and the symbol for or is like this. So we say P and Q, or we say not P or Q, like that. So that is the material that we covered previously. Today we shall talk about conditional statements and biconditional statements, and that is the topic of today. Consider the following example. This is an example of a conditional statement. If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. So a conditional statement is an if-then statement. It has two parts. If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. So, in fact, you can further characterize the conditional statement as this. If followed by this particular statement, then followed by this particular statement here. So what follows, the statement that follows the if, this is called a hypothesis. And what follows then, that part of the statement is called the conclusion. So a conditional statement has two parts. It has a hypothesis and it has a conclusion. So you can say if followed by hypothesis and then. So if followed by hypothesis and then followed by a conclusion. So that is the structure of a conditional statement. The reason it's called a conditional statement is that there's a condition being applied. That is, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. The condition for you to live in Illinois is that you have to be in Chicago. If this condition applies, then this conclusion applies. Okay, that's very important actually. The conclusion only applies if the hypothesis has already been established. Okay, in other words, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. But if you live in New York, this statement doesn't even apply to you. So don't bother reading the rest of it, so to speak. So, if you live in Chicago, if the hypothesis, if the first part of the statement is true, only then you can make any conclusion about this. If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. Now, this statement is a true statement, correct? If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. Now, a conditional statement, like over here, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois, is a type of a compound statement, isn't it? Because, but unlike a conjunction where you're using the word or a disjunction where you're using the word or, here you are using two separate words, if and then. So, a conditional statement is also a combination of two other statements, the first part being a hypothesis and the second part being the conclusion. And the way you symbolically represent a conditional statement is as follows. If P, then Q. Now here, P represents the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is represented by the statement P. The conclusion is represented by the statement Q. And you simply write P goes to Q like this. If P, then Q. So this is a symbolic representation of a conditional statement. Now, you can manipulate a conditional statement, and you can learn a lot about a particular topic by looking at things in a different way. So there are three important things that you can do with a conditional statement. If the original conditional statement is this, P, if P, then Q, then there are three additional types of statements, and they're given names. First is a converse state of this particular statement. A second is an inverse of the original statement. And the third is a contrapositive, P-O-S-I-T-I-V-E, a contrapositive. So first let's talk about the converse. If this is the original statement, the hypothesis being P and the conclusion being Q, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. So this statement is simply P, if P, then Q. The converse of this is the opposite statement. If you live in Illinois, then you live in Chicago. So the converse of this is written as follows. So the converse of a statement is simply switching the conclusion and the hypothesis like this. You can think about a converse like a reverse statement. It's like a reverse of the original statement. If the original statement is if P, then Q, then the converse is if Q, then P. You can see here that the converse is not necessarily true. If you live in Illinois, then you live in Chicago. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? You could live in, in Springfield, Illinois, or something like that. But this would be the converse, where you switch the conclusion and the hypothesis. So if the original statement is if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois, the converse would be just switching the conclusion and hypothesis, or the reverse of the statement. So the converse you can think of as the reverse of the statement. The inverse is simply a negation of the statement. If the original statement is if P, then Q, then the inverse if not P, then not Q. So the inverse of our particular statement will be as follows. You do not live in Chicago, then you do not live in Illinois. Now this is the inverse. You simply negated both this hypothesis and the conclusion. If you do not live in Chicago, then you do not live in Illinois. So you negated both the hypothesis and the conclusion like this. So if you do not live in Chicago, then you do not live in Illinois. Now that's also not necessarily true, because if you do not live in Chicago, you could live in Springfield or one of the suburbs of Chicago, and you still be in Illinois, correct? But nevertheless, this is the inverse of this particular statement. So this is the inverse. Let me write that in the same color over here. This is the inverse, and this over here is the converse of the original statement. And finally, there's another variation that you can produce using the same particular statement, and that's called the contrapositive. Now, contrapositive is like the biggest word, probably the most confusing of all of these words. Contrapositive is the inverse of the converse. What does that mean? Well, the contrapositive statement, to make a contrapositive statement from the original statement, first you do the converse. So you flip the statement. So P goes to Q, so Q goes to P. So contrapositive is the converse. You take the converse first. Q goes to P, and then you flip it. Like you do the inverse like this. Okay. So contrapositive is constructed by taking the inverse, that's the negation of the converse. So you first flip and then you negate, like you double, you do like you flip it and then you negate it. That's contrapositive. It's like a two-step process, and you can kind of try to remember it by, this is being the longest word. It takes the most effort to accomplish, because just to help you remember what the meaning of contrapositive. Contrapositive, to create a contrapositive statement, first you do the converse, like the reverse of the statement. So it's Q goes to P, and then you take the inverse of that reverse statement. You make both to be the negative statement, negation of that. So contrapositive is the inverse, the negation of the converse. So it's the inverse of the converse statement. Okay, so that's a contrapositive. So in our example, the contrapositive would be the following. If you do not live in Illinois, then you do not live in Chicago. That's true. If you don't live in Illinois, then definitely you ain't going to live in Chicago. So that's the contrapositive. The word positive is kind of confusing, I think it is for me, at least anyway, because you would think we make positive, but actually it's the negation of the converse. So to create a contrapositive statement, you take the original statement first. You make the converse of it, that you flip the hypothesis and conclusion, and once you do that, you make the inverse of that, and you negate it. Okay, so contrapositive is the inverse. As a review, this is the original conditional statement. The original conditional statement says, if P, then Q. That's how you read this. If P, then Q. The converse of that is just the reverse of that. If Q, then P. The inverse of the original statement is simply, if not P, then not Q. The inverse means just putting the negative in there. The contrapositive of the original statement is, if not Q, then not P. That is, you first flip them, and then you take the inverse of the flip. So these are 4 things you can do with a particular statement. The conditional statement, of course, as I said, consists of an if-then statement, the first part of it being the hypothesis, the second part of being the conclusion. The first part that follows the if is the hypothesis, the second part, that part that follows the then, is the conclusion. Now, I wanted to bring something to your attention here. You see, the first statement over here is true. If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois, correct? So that's a true statement. And then here, if you live in Illinois, then you live in Chicago. That's not necessarily true, so that's a false statement. And the third statement, if you do not live in Chicago, then you do not live in Illinois, assumes that there's nothing else and nobody else lives outside of Chicago and Illinois. They could live in the suburbs, or they could live in Springfield or Rockford or whatever, right? So this is also false. Then finally, if you do not live in Illinois, then you do not live in Chicago. That's a true statement, correct? So what you observe here is that both the converse and the inverse were false. And in the original statement and the contrapositive were both true. And this you will always see. That is, the converse and the inverse, they act as a pair. They're like best buddies. If one is true, the other one is, I'm going with you. It's true. If one is false, the other one says, okay, I'm going with you, and the other one is false. So both converse and inverse, either they will be both true or they will be both false. So they're like best buddies. In the same way, the original conditional statement and its contrapositive are also best buddies. Either they are both true or they are both false. And this is helpful because in logic, we want to analyze every statement and issue from different sides. And understanding these statements, the inverse, the converse, and the contrapositive of a particular topic really helps in getting deeper insight into a particular situation. But one thing that we have to appreciate is that the original conditional statement and contrapositive, they're like best buddies. They are either both true or they are both false. They either go, they both go in the same direction. And in the same way, the converse and the inverse are like best buddies. Either they are both true or they are both false. Now, in this case, the original statement, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. The converse of that statement, if you live in Illinois, then you live in Chicago, was false. It does not always have to be the case. That is, these don't always have to be true and false or false and true. But understand that these statements are always act as pairs. Two statements, in fact, that are both either true or both are false, that is, they are either both true or both false, are called logically equivalent statements. So two statements that are the same truth value, they're either both true, they're both false, they're called logically equivalent statements. Now consider the following example. If 3 points are coplanar, then they lie in the same plane. And that's pretty easy enough, because that's kind of like the definition of being coplanar. But nevertheless, if 3 points are coplanar, then they lie in the same plane. Now this is a conditional statement with the hypothesis if 3 points are coplanar, and the conclusion they lie in the same plane. So if P, then Q. So that's the original statement. The converse of this would be if Q, then P, right? So if you were to write the converse of this, or the reverse of this, it would be this. If 3 points are in the same plane, then they are coplanar. And that's true, isn't it? So in this case, as you can see, both the original statement, if P, then Q, and then the converse of this, if Q, then P, then they're both true. So both the original statement is true and the converse of it is true. In fact, when a statement and its both converse are true, that statement is called a biconditional statement, and you can simply write that as P and Q like this with a double arrow. This reflects a biconditional statement. That means both the original statement and its converse are true. And sometimes it's also written as if and only if, IFF. If and only if. Now, in mathematics and geometry, this if and only if has a very specific meaning. The meaning implied is that this is a biconditional statement. So like this, okay? 3 points are coplanar if and only if they lie in the same plane. So this word, if and only if, is a very powerful phrase, that phrase, if and only if, and that implies a biconditional statement. In other words, if P is Q and then Q and P, the converse, they are both true. So you can combine two statements like this into one statement like that, into a biconditional statement. So if you ever read something like this, 3 points are coplanar if and only if they lie in the same plane, you can derive from it two statements. First, if the 3 points are coplanar if they lie in the same plane, and secondly, if 3 points are in the same plane, then they are coplanar. So this is the way you represent or you write a biconditional statement, implying that both the condition, the original statement, conditional statement, and its converse are true. So biconditional statements are the special subcategory of conditional statements where the converse and the original conditional statement are both true. Okay, so as a review, we talked about conditional statements today. Conditional statements are if-then statements, and if is followed by the hypothesis, and then is followed by the conclusion. So they can be written symbolically as P goes to Q, or if P, then Q. So the way you would read this is if P, then Q. So that's how you would read this particular statement. So, and then if the original conditional statement is this, the converse of that is if Q, then P, and the inverse of that, if not P, then not Q. That's what that says over here. If not P, then not Q. And finally, the contrapositive is the inverse of the converse. If not Q, then not P. So, and I also suggested that the converse and the inverse are best buddies. That means they're either always both false or they're both true. And two statements that are of the same truth value, they're called logically equivalent statements. And I also suggested that the original conditional statement and the contrapositive are also logically equivalent statements. They're best buddies, that is, they're both true or they are both false. And in this particular example, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois, the converse was not true. But that doesn't always have to be the case. If the original statement and the converse are both true, that's a special scenario, and that's called a biconditional statement. You can write that as P and Q with the double arrow, and arrow going both ways, sometimes written like this, right? And this, or you can say if and only if. Okay, so if you live in Chicago, if and only if you live in Illinois, that would imply that would be a biconditional statement, which is not true in fact, but that's how you would say that. So biconditional statements are statements where both the original statement and the converse are true. Inshallah, next time we shall elaborate on this further. Until then, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.